Hi everyone, my name is 𝗃𝗵𝗃 and I'm happy to welcome you to this new streaming event produced by Aksioma Institute for Contemporary Art Ljubljana in collaboration with 𝗃𝗵𝗃 as part of Akcija, the screening program dedicated to documentary and artist movies we have initiated in 2012 to encourage public debates on topics related to our artistic program. For this year's edition, we have selected 𝗃𝗶𝗹𝗶, the first feature film by 𝗃𝗵𝗃, available in Slovenia these days as a video on demand. You can find all the necessary info in the link below. The movie is the last chapter of a larger project the artist began in 2013 called the Baragan Archives, which is a project that explores the contested legacy of Luis Barragan, Mexico's most famous architect, and how his legacy is affected by the fact that the private corporation 𝗏𝗏 owns his archives and controls the right in his name and work. For more than 20 years now, this corporation has made his work largely inaccessible to the public. The film therefore questions whether a single actor should be exclusively in control of how the world can engage with Baragan's work. Thus allowing the public to engage with an artwork in various ways and from multiple perspectives threaten its integrity or make it more integral to society over time. Today we are here with 𝗏𝗵𝗍 to discuss the proposal and try to shed lights on the relationship between capitalism and the artistic cultural heritage. We'll do it with the complicity of the writer and critic 𝗏𝗵𝗍, of our special guest in the studio, and with the contribution of those who will decide to share with us their thoughts, doubts, questions via the web chat available on our website. 𝗏𝗵𝗍 is an American conceptual artist, writer, and filmmaker whose work is deeply ingrained in her lived experience, exploring and blurring the boundaries between art and life. Through her performance-based practice, 𝗏𝗍 has initiated intimate relations with a number of organizations and structures of authority. She explores the emotional, philosophical, and legal tensions between the individual and protective institutions such as the intelligence agencies or the police. To work alongside or within large organizations, 𝗏𝗍 makes use of institutional quirks, systemic loopholes that allow her to make contact with people on the other side. Her work tends to be characterized by the dynamics of seductions, the resulting narratives often taking the form of a love story. It is typical of 𝗏𝗍's practice that she follows the rules of engagement within institutions to the letter, sometimes to the point of absurdity. 𝗏𝗵𝗍 instead is the founder of We Make Money Not Art, a blog which received 2 Webby Awards, the honorary mention at the Start Prize, known for exploring connections between art, science, technology, and social issues. She writes and lectures internationally about the way in which artists, hackers, and designers use technology as a medium for critical discussion. 𝗏𝗵𝗍, thanks for accepting my invitation. To frame the topic, I suggest we start the session by watching together the trailer of the proposal, and then I will leave you the floor with pleasure. Thanks.
Federica, I know my offer is unorthodox, but please know my proposal stands. I thank you infinitely, as it was you who led me to Baragan, and Baragan who brought me back to you. I would like to invite you to my exhibition at Kunsthal St. Gallen. I designed the work, firstly, for you.
Dear 𝗏𝗵𝗍, while sharing your interest and enthusiasm in the work of Luis Baragan, I am also aware of the differences between your eminently artistic approach and mine. I trust you would make yourself aware of the possible implications of any sort of reproduction.
Because this is a question of money and control.
I'm thinking of calling Baragan's ghost.
This is an unprecedented story. An American artist took 525 grams of Luis Baragan's ashes, the most widely recognized Mexican architect,
Dearest Federica, I await your response.
Hello, everyone. First of all, a big thank you to Aksioma for this invitation to moderate the conversations we're going to have with 𝗏𝗵𝗲 today. We're going to talk about artist legacies, corporate power, copyrights imposed over cultural works and over national heritage. And we might also maybe evoke the ghost of Mexico's most admired architect. So I'm going to try and not repeat what Janez has just said about 𝗏𝗵𝗲's work, but to me, what makes her practice so compelling is that she's really charming her way into these cold, massive, intimidating institutional structures. She has a talent for circumventing stern refusals and roadblocks that would, discourage the vast majority of us. But I think because her artistic practice is characterized by extraordinary patience and by ingenuity, she has managed to establish personal relationships with impersonal structures of authority, whether it is the Dutch Secret Service Agency or the New York City Police. And by doing so, she not only interrogates structures of power on an intimate level, but she also plays with their regulation. And I would say that 𝗏𝗵𝗲 is a master in the art of exploiting the gaps that are inherent to massive governmental systems. But today, our discussion is not going to focus on the way the artist interacted with intelligence agencies or with law enforcement units. We are going to explore, as Janez said, how she, for the first time, I think, how she worked with privatized power. And in particular, we will look at the issue of control behind the privatization of Luis Barragan's professional archives. And from there, we will zoom out and also examine how art in general can become a commodity, how it can fall into private ownership, but also how art in turn can become a methodology through which challenging issues can be dissected and contested. I would really like to start with the story behind the fate of Luis Barragan's archives, because it starts with what looks like a remarkably romantic gesture. So it starts with the story of this rich businessman who happens to be the chairman of the Swiss furniture company 𝗏𝗏. He falls in love with an architecture historian, and she's called Federica Zanco. Federica Zanco has a lot of professional admiration for the work of the Mexican architect Luis Barragan. And so the businessman buys the professional archives of Barragan for her, along with the intellectual property rights to his design. So this becomes his engagement gift, instead of a very banal engagement ring. And the story might or it might not be true. Probably that doesn't really matter. What is really interesting here is the subplot. It's all the network of copyright and intellectual property control. It's the corporate privatization of culture behind this lovely story. So the situation now is that for the past 20 years or so, I think since 1995, the archives of Barragan have been split in two. His personal archives remain in Mexico, and meanwhile the professional archives are locked inside a bunker. And this bunker is part of this vast network of underground military shelters that are located beneath the beautiful landscape of the notoriously discreet and secretive country that is Switzerland. So Federica Zanco and 𝗏𝗏 have since very, very tightly restricted the access to Barragan's professional material. It's difficult to get access to it, even if you're a researcher, a designer, an architect. And they're also enforcing the copyrights with what I would call an iron fist. So these are some of the many issues that the documentary of 𝗏𝗏 is investigating. And before inviting her in the conversation, I just wanted to give you an idea of how the streaming session is going to unfold. I'm going to have a conversation with 𝗏𝗏 for something like 45 to 50 minutes. We'll show some maybe a couple of extracts from a feature documentary, 𝗃𝗶𝗹𝗹. And then I will quietly fade away. And as Janez said, I will leave space for the expert whom Aksioma has invited. If I remember correctly, there is one expert in architecture, someone who's an expert in artistic heritage, and there is a third expert, this time in intellectual property, and each of them will have, I'm sure, fascinating questions for Gilles. And then there will be time for you to address any question you might have to the artist via the chat that you can find on Aksioma's streaming page. So yeah, after this ultra-long conversation, introduction, Gilles, first of all, thank you so much for accepting to spend this 1 hour, 1 hour and a half with us. I would like to go back in time because 𝗃𝗶𝗹𝗹 is your first feature documentary, but it is the final chapter, or at least one of the final chapters in this vast multimedia project called the Baragan Archives. It's a several-year-long adventure made of exhibition and installation, performances, sculptures, and even publications. And I'd like to go back to the first time you show works linked, related to the Baragan Archive. It was in 2013, it was in New York, and you had a show called Woman with Sombrero. And maybe someone at Aksioma could show images of women with sombrero while we're talking. But in that multimedia installation, I think you were already playing with the tension between talking about Baragan's contested legacy while also acknowledging the copyright restrictions imposed by Federica Zanco. So could you explain to us how you navigated between presenting works that she did not allow you to see and also remaining within the confines of the law?
Yes. Well, firstly, also, I want to thank Aksioma and Janez for inviting me, and that I feel very lucky to be screening the film with them in Slovenia, and am excited to talk to you, Regine. So, saying that, I'll jump into your question about women with sombreros. So. The Baragan Archives, as Regine said, it was a multi-year, multimedia project in which the film was kind of a culminating gesture that we'll talk about later. But Women with Sombrero was what I consider the first chapter of the Baragan Archives. And what preceded it, or which also unfolds within it, is that I had learned after visiting Casa Baragan in Mexico City and starting to get a little bit more familiar with Baragan's work, I became very interested in the fact that the story that Regine said about the personal archive and the professional archive, and that there were all these rules and restrictions over the reproduction of Baragan's works, or the showing of his works, or taking pictures at Casa Baragan and then publishing them. And even earlier in my work in 2005, I did a piece called Auto Portrait Pending, in which I myself was curious about artistic legacy and how that was monetized. So it was concerns that I'd been having. And then the situation of Baragan's contested archive in this, its transformation into property that could be highly controlled through law, really enabled a great platform to take these questions up of, like, what does it mean when a corporation buys the rights to an artist? I consider Baragan an artist and an architect. What does it mean when a corporation buys not only the archive, but along with it controls the copyrights, intellectual property rights, and even with the case of Baragan, the trademark to his name? And what what happens when those laws are enforced. So the first thing I did was reach out to 𝗵𝗶 𝗍𝗶, who is the director of the Baragan Foundation, which at Vitra's headquarters controls the archives. And I had heard in Mexico that it was very hard to get access to the foundation and see the archives. But at this point, I had an invitation from 𝗏𝗏𝗄 to do a new commissioned work. And so I thought maybe with the help of 𝗏𝗏𝗄, because I wasn't a single artist, but I had an institutional backing, maybe I could get access to explore Baragan's archive. And that request was denied. And then Art in General, where I had the first exhibition of Women with Sombrero, they also offered a show. And by that point, I'd had permission to access Baragan's personal archive at Casa Baragan. And so I got to know Baragan that way through his personal archive. And then I invited Federica to kind of collaborate with me and create a show in New York in which hopefully she could lend things from Baragan's professional archive and I would make artworks based on the personal archive, and together we could offer a more fulsome image of Baragan. But that request was also denied. And in that letter, as you see in the film, there was a statement that said, although I was allowed to show anything original, the actual thing from Baragan's archive or personal archive, that if I reproduced anything, there were legal consequences to that. So I used that as the kind of thesis, you could say, of the show. So I took it as a question. Okay, so how do you represent something that you're legally unable to represent? So it's a very simple question in a way. And in that original letter or the second letter to Federica, I had said, for example, here are some objects and images from the professional archive I'd love you to be able to show. And so I took those pieces that I suggested as my works that I wanted to show in the exhibition alongside my own artworks. But then there was that question of how do I show them? And I worked with a lawyer and started really digging into copyright law and intellectual property rights, and had to come up with new formal solutions of how to show the work that almost infringed on the copyright over the work, but just pushed it hard enough that it was challenging, but not over the line that if I were sued, I would definitely lose the court case. And that led to a series of forms. So right there on the slide, you have a picture of the butaca chair that Baragan designed along with 𝗏𝗏𝗄𝗴𝗏. So that chair, which is in the professional archive, is also represented by Vitra. They have a miniature collection where famous furniture of many different architects is recreated in 1:6 proportion, very beautifully, in almost the exact way as its indexical relationship to the real chair. So because I couldn't show the chair, I, off eBay, bought a miniature butaca chair, and then I photographed it, and I blew it up 6 times, so it was the exact dimensions of the real chair, and mounted it so it would be hard, and installed it always so that it's flush with the floor. So that's a photograph of it. It stands in for the chair. So each sculptural piece that I made was a kind of solution, you could say, at showing something that I otherwise couldn't
show. And the hope of doing that is to not only create a beautiful work, which really is important to me, a work that that is formally interesting, but also ends up begging the question of why? Why is it in this form? Why is it not the chair? Why is it a picture of the chair? Or the framed books would be another example. Why is this book framed so awkwardly? You know, and that through those formal solutions that the questions get asked.
Okay, I see. So if I understand correctly, at the time, in 2013, at the time of Women with Sombrero, you were not engaged in making the documentary yet. So I think it came later. So when exactly did you decide that you not only wanted to develop sculptures, installation, write publications, maybe about Baragan Archives, but when did you start thinking, and why did you start thinking that it might be a good idea to make a feature documentary about it? And what were the challenges of beginning this film while you were already deep into the project itself?
Yeah, that's a great question, because it did unfold in a kind of, I guess, untraditional way. Throughout my practice, I've always made video pieces and even a few very short films, which are completely different than making a feature film. But I also write books, and within a lot of the larger projects, I'm always writing, and I've written 4 books, and I was writing along the whole way, not only the letters between Federica and I, but my experiences, in case there would be a book. So during Woman with Sombrero, which went on for 2 years, because also when I showed Woman with Sombrero in France, for instance, at Yvon Lambert, there's different jurisdiction in France. So what is permissible in the US is not permissible in France. And it was very important and fun for me to readdress each work under French law. So that's why in the pictures you see the 𝗵𝗲𝗀, which is this like wooden sculpture that shows reproductions of works. I got permissions for the photographs that are on that because they come from the personal archive, but the 𝗵𝗲𝗀 is part of the professional archive. So my Swiss lawyer was like, you can't show that work because in the States you have an ability to show a design piece, but in France you don't. So I ended up covering it with a blanket. So whenever it's shown in outside of the US or places that allow this, it has to be covered with a blanket. And actually the Pompidou Museum acquired Woman with Sombrero as an installation. So most of its life now will be covered in blankets this way when it's shown. But so for that period, I was working on Woman with Sombrero and not thinking of this larger film. And then I was asked to do a new piece by the filmmaker 𝗏𝗏𝗏, who made the documentary Citizen 4. And while I was working on this piece for her show at the Whitney, and I had access to Edward Snowden's archive, and I made a piece based off that, Laura asked me what I was working on. And I told her that I was working still on the Baragan Archives project, and I was sort of knee deep in the process of the proposal, which I won't fully give away because it's in the film, but that I was waiting for the Mexican Congress to approve my idea for this next project. And she said, "Are you filming this?" And I said, "No, I'm going to document it, but I not beyond that." And she said, "Well, I think you should make it a short film." And I was like, "Well, that'd be great. I've always wanted to make a film." And she said, "Write me a proposal." And I did, and I got funding for a short film. And then the short film kept growing. And then eventually it was clear that it could be a feature, and then it was. So it was a challenge of not beginning filming till later in the process. But of course, it was the piece itself is not just the proposal. You know, it's all of these works leading up to it. So there was that very interesting challenge within the film of how do you bring these concerns that I wasn't able to film at the time into the documentary sufficiently, so those, you know, the film can ask the questions that it needs to.
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to show a first extract from the movie because I think it will explain the situation regarding Baragan's professional archives, and also it shows how the press reacted to it.
In 1995, Vitra purchased far more than the physical archive. The corporation also acquired the intellectual property rights in all of Baragan's work. This entitles it to widely control visual representations of his architecture, even though it doesn't own any of his actual buildings. These rights are strictly enforced. The Baragan Foundation claims these rights regardless of the image's origins or the medium in which it will be presented. Renowned photographer 𝗴𝗶𝗶𝗶 took a wealth of images of Baragan's work in the 1960s, decades before the archive was purchased. 𝗴𝗶𝗶𝗃 owns the photographs, but the foundation controls their circulation. In 2007, filmmaker 𝗗𝗵𝗲 wanted to make a film about Baragan's architecture.
Yeah, what is interesting in the film is that later on in the documentary, you add that even the images you are filming inside of Baragan's house while you are staying there could be restricted, but that did not stop you when you film inside Casa Baragan. You brought a camera with you. So I think my question is going to be in the same lines as the first one I asked. It's about this balance between showing and not being allowed to show. So what are specific loopholes you found, and what kind of strategies did you develop to navigate around these interdictions and get the images that you needed of the house and also of other buildings despite the strict control imposed by Vitra?
Yeah, so that was like a really big difference between Woman with Sombrero and the second half of the Baragan Archives, which I call the proposal, even though that's one work, because there's the sculptural piece, installation, and then also the film. Confusingly have the same names. but the questions I was asking there were slightly different. So in Woman with Sombrero, like I said, I wanted to first understand, like, what are the laws surrounding reproduction? What am I able to do? What am I not able to do? And how can I push those as hard as possible? And then the second half of it was a more, I don't know if active's the right word, but let's just use it for now, was like, what happened, like, could I actually disturb the status of the archive? Could I open up a different kind of loophole that sort of gives the possibility, what happens if the archive, instead of being closed, is shared? Is there a way to get that, to reverse this story that of the engagement present, you know, that rather than getting a ring, you get the archive, you know, could you reverse the legend? So that was a very big question in filming. How do you do that? Because you're not supposed to represent the architecture. So there were I had to get a lot of entertainment lawyers. And we had to really sit through each shot of the film and the way that I talk about even the part that you just saw, even the wording of things, we went over with the lawyers of how do you frame that. So one thing I should say is that anyone can get sued. Like, you can get sued for anything. It's whether you have a strong case or not. So there were a lot of questions that were in balance of like, am I transforming the space enough with the film as a whole? At least in the United States, with fair use, there's 4 points in which fair use that you can argue, and one of them is a critical take of a situation. So the film is a critical take of very important questions of our time about property and ownership and all of that. So that was a tactic that we discussed with the lawyers, but also the framing of that you don't really see the full rooms at one time. What are you shooting from within the space? What are you shooting from out of the space? So I would just say that my talks with the lawyers was a huge part of making the film.
Yeah, there is. So you had this preoccupation of infringing possible copyright, but I also wonder if you were thinking about Baragan himself, because he's very much at the core of the film, and you seem to have obviously a lot of respect for his work, and perhaps even some kind of fascination with who he was as a man. But he's not there anymore. So did you ever feel at some moment a certain fear that you might betray him, that you might have used his house and his legacy in a way you would not approve of? Maybe you've pursued ideas you would have found objectionable. So was it a concern? Was he a concern?
Yeah, I would say those are two. They're always interrelated, but there was like the questions of legality and those boundaries that are set up by the law and how they're enforced by the owners of the rights. And then, of course, there's the work itself, and Baragan, the maker of that work, and all of the ethical questions that go along with that, which of course I thought about and wrestled with throughout the entire project. I mean, I think that all of my projects, that's really at the core, is, you know, who are we in relationship to these rules? And like a lot of, you know, people will ask me about the ethical questions around using ashes or these kinds of things. And those are important. Or staying in the house for a week and these kind of things. But also it's very important that we also ask the questions of what does it mean when someone wins the Pritzker Prize and their contribution to architecture and art is invaluable, and so few people have access to it. Baragan, for instance, was very aware at the time of making his architecture that not a lot of people were traveling to Mexico as they were, let's say, to Europe or the United States. And so he was very aware that photography of his work was super important and which publications it was included in. So the reproduction of his work through photography was something that Baragan took extremely seriously. And he had a trusted photographer, Armando Salas Portugal, and Vitra was very aware of that. So not only did they buy Baragan's archive, they bought the rights to all 30 years of Armando Salas Portugal's photographs of his work. So these are also very important questions, like what does it mean when the circulation of images are controlled so tightly? So for me, being an artist, I firstly was just very moved by Baragan's architecture and his work. And when I first moved through his house, my first desire was I want to sleep here and write and experience it alone, because you're oftentimes, or all the time, I think, led through Casa Baragan on a tour by like an architectural student. And so you have this kind of like voiceover with you, guiding you through on this very set path. And it was kind of like creating this movie in my head. And that really stuck with me. So in terms of like how I felt in the house and the ethical questions of engaging with this man's work, when of course, as in all legacy, the author is not there, you know? So people always ask me, well, what do you think Baragan would think of XYZ? And I'm like, I don't know. And neither do you, even if you knew him well, you know? I mean, I'm sure my children, they know me and my work, but like ask them in 20 years about what I was thinking at the time of making something. I don't know if they'll, you know, these are very subjective things. And so the affect of Baragan's work is extremely important. And I just believe that all affectation as it is felt by the viewer or the person within the space is important. And so what I held very close to me is that I try to represent the feeling of Baragan's work. And for instance, I think a lot of his photographs that he took, they're characterized often of a bird's eye point of view or extremely low point of view. And none of them are a very human, eye level point of view. And it was very important to me and my cinematographer, Jared. We were the only ones in the house. I did not have some big crew. We both stayed very close to the experience of the work and tried to represent a kind of portrait of Baragan that I could feel really close to and strongly about. So all of the questions were that I took were very well thought out. And when I say well thought out, I mean like I talked about them with myself, with people close to me, with my collaborators, and even with the family.
Oh, I'm going to ask you to develop something you just touched upon, because I was curious about the aesthetic qualities of your film. And I was wondering if how much they've been, you've mentioned it already, but can you develop how much they've been influenced and maybe guided by Baragan's style, because it's characterized by very seducing geometric volumes, by sharp angles, and it also has this sensuality with which it plays with light and shadows. And of course, there are these warm and bright colors. So has the architectural style of Baragan, of his house in particular, helped shape the way the film was shot, but also edited?
Yeah, so I think a good way to answer that is one was talking about this point of view that of this very like, in a way I saw myself, you know, Baragan designed Casa Baragan for around his body. You know, the proportions of everything was about his body, and I'm a lot smaller than Baragan was. So it was really related to my body within his space. It was the feeling of the work, but also my body within the space. And within the film, you see often that the camera is behind me. And it kind of, I'm leading the story, right? Because there's the existing status of the archive, and then there's me as one of the protagonists that's disturbing that and questioning it. So the camera's kind of behind me, and I'm leading you into the story. So that's one perspective. And then I was lucky enough to get permission to sleep in 𝗏𝗶𝗹𝗃 for a week, and I wrote about the experience. Not all the time was the camera on, you know, so I was experiencing that, and a lot of the voiceover is taken, adapted directly from that writing. So I think the experience of the space, the way the light moved, you know, I really started understanding the space. So I would say, Jared, you got to come over at 5 a.m. and we've got to start here, because the way the light changes as it moves through the day is really exceptional, you know. Or I was also told stories about the space. So and one of them was like in that original walkthrough of 𝗏𝗶𝗹𝗃, the guide told me that those vessels, you know, the ceramic vessels that are outside in Baragan's garden, it used to be that his studio opened up onto that space. He was always changing where the openings were. But there was a moment where the studio opened up onto those vessels, and the guide said that every morning the maids would dip the vessels into the water out there, and the smell of wet clay would waft through into Baragan's studio. And I found that so beautiful, you know, that he wanted that smell of the wet clay. And then when I was there, I tried to lift one of the vessels, and I'm pretty strong, and there's just like no way that anyone's lifting those vessels. So I pour the water on, and then I smell the smell. And so, like, how do you get a smell in? How do you get that feeling? So it was very important to me that Baragan's work, my experience with Baragan's work, and with the Swiss landscape, because that's also in it, that all of those affective feelings and sensory experiences were in the film as much as could be. So even like when we were doing color, let's say, I kind of thought, okay, so Mexico has these rich colors on warmth, and the Swiss landscape was a colder, bluer light. So it was throughout the entire experience, through design of the music, color, sound, the way it was shot, were all like informed by my experience of Baragan's work, and also of this kind of seductive unfolding that the work takes, and that I experience. And one last thing to say is about this idea of Baragan not being there. I've always been really inspired by, in cinema, when you feel the presence of something or someone, even when they're not in the frame. So for instance, Pasolini did this film, not Pasolini, excuse me, 𝗏𝗶𝗹𝗃. Oh my goodness, maybe I've had too much coffee. Antonioni, sorry. Antonioni's film 𝗏𝗶𝗃, at the beginning of the film, Anna, the protagonist, disappears. And yet you feel her throughout the entire film, even though she's not there. And that was extremely inspiring to me. In the proposal, I wanted you to feel Baragan's presence, even though he was absent. And I think you do. I think that you can feel him in the film. So that was something I really wanted to get.
Right. I think it might be a good time to show the other clip from the proposal, because in this one, you see these two types of landscape and architecture you were talking about. We're going to see, if I'm not wrong, we're going to see the 𝗏𝗏 Design Museum designed by Frank Gehry, that's in Basel, and we're going to see a few moments inside the house. But the reason why I wanted to show the clips now is because we get to hear the early correspondence between you and Federica Zanco.
And just one thing, just to clarify, the Frank Gehry building you see is not there's a different Frank Gehry that's that. It's actually the headquarters in Bergsfelden of Vitra, and underneath is the Baragan Foundation. Just for the architecture buffs listening, I want to make so sorry, continue.
Dear Federica Zanco, you may recall that I reached out to you this past winter requesting permission to visit the Baragan Foundation. I was sorry it was not possible for me to view the foundation at that time. In the meantime, I have been fortunate enough to receive full access to Baragan's personal archive. I have been spending time in his house and studio, reading his letters, browsing through his collection of photographs, and perusing his library. While I am getting a sense of Baragan the man, I want to better understand him as an architect. This November, I have a solo exhibition in New York in which I will be displaying the works that I've made based on photos and text from Baragan's personal archive. I am writing to invite you to curate a number of pieces from Baragan's professional archive to be displayed within the show. As you know the archive so intimately, I welcome any material that you can offer. I sincerely hope that you are able to contribute to this project. With warmth and admiration, 𝗏𝗏.
Dear 𝗏𝗏, while sharing your interest and enthusiasm in the work of Alois Baragan, I am also aware of the differences between your eminently artistic approach and mine. I am involved with scholarly research on Baragan and his archives since 1995. And the book we're trying to complete is the conclusion of a very long, thorough investigation of original sources, documents, and testimonies. Given this fact, I really cannot consider contributing to your exhibition within this short notice. While you are of course fully entitled to display objects and original documents from any collection, I trust you would make yourself aware of the possible copyright implications of any sort of reproduction.
Right. One thing I wanted to say is that if you're watching this and you have questions and comments for Gilles, please write them down in the chat of Aksioma, and Neja is going to collect them and read them towards the end of the streaming session. But to come back to the clip, the reason why I wanted to see a bit of it was to get a sense of Federica, but also to get a sense of the kind of refusals and hurdles you kept encountering again and again while making the film. And something I found surprising about the proposal is that I follow your work. I saw parts of the Baragan Archives in several exhibitions, and I kind of knew how it would end. I knew how it would unfold, but yet I still felt a sense of suspense, and even it had elements of thriller, because it felt like at every single moment something could have gone wrong. Like Federica, she could have completely ignored you. The Baragan's heir could have told you, let's go home, gringa. And the Mexican state could have also turned down your request. Baragan might not have been incinerated. You might not have been allowed to, like, everything could have gone wrong. So how do you make a film when you have such a limited control over the general narrative? How do you manage to work with so many unknowns, so many refusals, so many stalemates without losing a general sight of where you want to go?
It's a great question, because every single one of the examples you gave was very took time and a lot of energy, and I didn't know. The answer is I didn't know. Like, it took me just as long to get permission to sleep in 𝗏𝗏𝗃 as it got permission to access the ashes. So each of those questions was quite a lot of back and forths and reframing and listening very well to, for instance, when I asked if I could sleep in 𝗏𝗏𝗃, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. At first the answers were no, but with all my work, it's like, okay, I understand that's a very difficult question, and the people I'm posing it to are just trying to take care of the house, you know, I understand that, of course. So it's like, okay, so what exactly are the issues, you know? And then they'll, over a long period of letters, it's like, well, this is something we're concerned about, and that's something we're concerned about. And so then it becomes the challenge to, okay, well, how do we address that? So it's no longer a concern. Do we need a guard? Okay, we can get a guard. Do we, you know, what are the specific things? And like there were times, for instance, where Congress was supposed to meet about the ashes. We were all waiting, everyone's there, and then it didn't come up that day in the meeting. And so there were always, you know, these challenges. And in a way, I feel, even though it didn't come easily, I feel so lucky that it did turn out the way it did. But I also think that this kind of practice that I have, you have to sort of be ready all the time that you think you're going in one direction and an obstacle comes up and you need to incorporate that, and maybe it goes somewhere else. So that's what I always had to feel, is that I had to be really, of course I have what I think is the idea of making the proposal of what it was, when I had it, and then I did learn that he was cremated and all these other things, it just seemed almost like I was on a mission to serve the question. Like I just almost was like, how do you not make this artwork? Like it's asking to be made. And so then it's almost like you become in service of that and you do what you need to do. But that being said, like when Federica, I don't want to ruin it for anyone who hasn't seen it, but like when her response was that she could or could not be somewhere at a certain time, it was like, okay, let's move the production there then, right? So you have to think about those things. And about Federica, I would say that I'm really indebted to her, because she didn't ignore me. She wrote me multiple times. Many of the letters aren't even included in the film, and really engaged with me and this project, nor this film would not be possible if she had not. So as challenging as things are, and that we share different points of view, I'm extremely respectful of the way she engaged me and challenged challenged me.
I think that makes a lot for the thriller element. So it's already 6 in Central Europe. We have 1 minute for my last very, very obvious question is that, are you still in touch with Federica Zanco, and has she acknowledged the film and your work around the archive and reacted to it in any way?
The short answer is that before the film was premiered at Tribeca Film Festival, I wrote her a long letter kind of saying what I just said to you, that the film was happening, that I was thankful to her. But no, I did not hear back from her. I have heard from people who know her that she's seen the film. But I think, you know, the proposal is open. It's a pregnant question that lasts her lifetime, and you never know when we may speak. But the work right now, I think, is speaking for me.
Thank you. So I think
Thank
it's
you.
time. It's time for me to fade out and let the experts in Ljubljana address their questions to you, Gilles. So before I turn off my microphone, I don't remember if I have to turn off. Anyway, before someone turns off my microphone, I would like to remind once again that if you have questions for Gilles, please write them down in the chat section, and Neja is going to read them and then later on read them out to Gilles. So back to the Ljubljana studio.
Thank you, Regine.
Hello. I have a question. It seemed to me that you came across an unprocessed archive. I'm as working in the museum. I know working with architectural archives is one of the most demanding things. It's something that people don't notice when they come to the archives. It takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of money. It takes a lot of time. I'm not justifying what's going on in the Baragan Foundation. When you come to their website, it says coming soon, and it seems that this coming soon is going on for more than 20 years now. And what I wanted to ask you, if the archive would finally open, are you thinking about making another proposal, and what this proposal would be?
Well, first to speak to your question or experience rather of what it is to run an archive. And yeah, the archive, as I have never seen it, at least the professional archive, but I hear it's very well organized. But one thing I want to say to that is any archive, once you're going to it and it's been organized, organization is full of choices, right? What are the categories? What's considered important? What's not considered important? I know from going to, I did a whole project, and actually a series of projects related to 𝗏𝗏𝗃 and his relationship with Baragan. I have a show up at the Dia Museum now in Bridgehampton related to it. And one thing about archives that are so interesting is even if they are accessible, let's say online, it's really different to see something online than it is to go and hold a letter that might have notes in the margins and stuff that don't show up in what's online. So this idea of a processed archive or an unprocessed archive is also very fascinating to me, because you start learning about the person or the organization that organized it as well. So the proposal gives an opportunity to share the archive. And one thing I think about that proposal is that you can interpret it, or the Baragan Foundation could interpret it in many different ways. You know, how would it be shown? How would it be accessible? I think it's very exciting, this idea of different ways it could be open. So it's hard for me to say now, would I do something else? I do think that the gestures rather of all the work I've done thus far and the film, and even like ending with the question, does the work right now that I feel needs to be done from me. So in a way, I would say I don't feel I need another gesture, but you're right that this is real life and it's unfolding, and maybe there would be something that would happen that would really inspire another question. So I don't shut the door. I just think it would be a different question.
Hi, hello from Ljubljana. My name is Maja, and I was invited here as a lawyer, as a copyright expert. So of course I need to fulfill my mission and ask some or make a comment about that. You are addressing extremely important question with this provocative performance of yours that you're doing, and that is that probably copyright today lasts too long, and it's very and offers to everyone who is a holder of copyright an opportunity to limit access to knowledge that everybody else wants to access. And you are right about that, to making to bringing that up, and to making a very important point about that. The works of Louis Barragan are going to be in public domain. This means that they will be able to be used freely in terms of copyright only in 2059. That means 70 years after the death. So the most important message from me as a copyright expert who works a lot in the area of access to copyright, or on the exceptions and limitations of copyright, it's very important to establish like this. So my question about that would be, you say that but on the other hand, Barragan Foundation is owning copyright, and they have copyright policy, and they have very diligent copyright policy, and also like they very well informed public that they can rely on copyright exceptions. And I'm sure that many scholars, researchers, and educators can use Barragan's work because they use exceptions. My question is that you say that the foundation enforces copyright very strictly. And I was looking for court cases, because this is what enforcing copyright mean. And I couldn't find any copyright case. So I would like to see whether there is a like very strict policy where you like afraid of using all this, or were you consulting lawyers to do that, or did you sometimes tried something and you were actually sued, or that some legal things happen? So that would be a legal question. And also as a citizen, I have a observation that I really, although I'm using time, would want to make. Like Louis Barragan, a great architect, he never really enjoyed the company of women, I think. And now he's a victim, in a way, in my eyes, of three very egoistic women. The first one is 𝗴𝗶𝗶𝗃, who sold his archive for a lot of money. I think that Barragan was not thinking that she, at the end, will make this decision. And second, the art historian, Signora Francesca Zanche, she's in a way also like very egoistic. I know she's like wanting to protecting this archive, but she's doing a rather not very good job. I think personally, my opinion, that she's not able to give, that she wants to give access to archive, but she's not really capable of doing that. And at the end is you're also extremely egoistic. Like with the help of his family that he probably didn't really want to have a lot in common with, you decided to take his remains, part of his body, to use this in this movie. You're making very important points regarding copyright and intellectual property, but the method of yours is extremely egoistic. So I don't know whether before he died, he really envisioned this future. Probably he would manage his legacy a little bit different if he would know that this would happen. So two kind of question. And you can just comment the last one, but I would like to learn whether you know about any court cases that actually took place regarding his copyright.
Thank you. So to answer the first part of the legal questions is if you go to Sternberg Press, there is a book, maybe I can run out at some point and grab it, or we can put it in the chat, but there was a book, an architectural publication through Sternberg Press, and there is an essay within that book that does list different examples around the law and copyright in which there were problems. Legally, there is also, as you know, as a copyright lawyer, there's also the threat of copyright, like I got and a bunch of other people that I know. For instance, a lot of PhD candidates contacted me that they were unable to write their PhD on Baragan because they couldn't get access to the archive. So I think there's a lot of different ways to use the law, and I stick to the language that I said about enforcing copyright, because there is the law and then there's the enforcement of the law. And there's a lot of latent laws that are only used, as we all know, right now, at least in the States, around racism and homophobia. For instance, where laws were written to seem innocuous, but they're invoked when it's used against people who have harder times with representation. So I think it's not just court cases, it's the threat of court cases. For a lot of people, the idea of getting a lawyer and fighting something is very expensive and scary. So that's one thing. In terms of egoism, you're absolutely entitled to your opinion of what is egoistic and what's not egoistic. I will tell you from my own experience of the amount of years I put into this and what you get out of that much making work and speaking to people. I think there's probably more successful ways to be egoistic than maybe I've tried. But I think when you're looking at the perspective of different people, I know a lot of Mexicans, yes, were very, very, very angry at Rosario for selling Baragan's archive in the first place. She was, I'm not making excuses for her, but she had her own challenges. Her husband had just died, who the rights were left to her. And like the original comment, it is a lot of work to manage an archive. And I don't know if she had the kind of resources that, let's say, the Vitra company does in terms of being able to support such a practice. Federica, I don't know if she's egoistic. I don't want to speak on top of her. I think that she does seem to love Baragan's work and is trying to ensure his legacy. I just have questions about the inaccessibility of it and why that is so threatening. And would it really be so threatening to the organization if more people had access to Baragan's work? If anything, my belief is that a great artwork stays great the more it is engaged, right? Its relevancy is only based upon it being known and being debated, or people hating it or people loving it, but they have to be able to access it to do that. So, in terms of myself, I believe that I am one of a multitude of voices who should speak to Baragan's practice. And I agree that the proposal is a very big move that I engage, like I say in the film, I say I am aware I am entering a story that has not previously involved me, and that by doing so, I may affect the story. And like Regine asked about these ethical questions, for me, the idea that someone's whole life work, that copyright is not protecting Baragan. Copyright is protecting the owner of Baragan's legacy, and it's not Baragan. And we have this thing in capitalistic society that all things are property, but that's not true. A thing is a thing, and then property is the human relationship to that thing. And I do think it's very important in our society where you can buy the rights to genes, you can buy the right to DNA, to pharmaceutical products, and to someone's archive, that be challenged. And it was not until the gesture of the proposal, like Women with Sombrero was written about a lot, but it didn't really ruffle people's feathers. And the proposal did. And it led to a 2-hour debate on national television in Mexico about what to do with archives and reconsidering the law. And I think sometimes you have to push really hard or ask the question in a very challenging way for the question to be heard. And so for me, I stand by that, that gesture.
Hello.
Hello.
I have a really hard time. I'm the last one, and you have covered. I think you have covered everything. So perhaps, as an artist, perhaps I could share with you the way how you have also transformed us, the audience, not only the people involved in the film, into characters, but also us. Because if I kind of felt interpolated, because I'm also a member of art community, although a provincial one and from a province, and I can just admire the architect, yourself, the capitalist, like representatives, of one could say privilege, but I would say successful examples of these three different realms, and you have involved us into a certain play and a character through the film, of course, because I haven't seen the exhibitions and everything else. So the way how you narrate the story, although it has obstacles and all that, but you have successfully narrated it in a way that we somehow become your allies. We become, we actually get into a relationship of an alliance with the artist's moral quest. And there is a risk of understanding the film, the point of the film, like you point the finger to this pathology of possession. Like my question simply would be, I mean, I admire your resourcefulness, of course. I mean, just taking the law and using it as a formal exercise of how the works will look like. I mean, this is always, I think it works always. So my question would be, so is there just a problem of generosity? So there's not a problem of capitalism or intellectual property, which actually feeds us all in this business. So it actually is part of our business realm. So it's just the problem that we don't experience, or there is no generosity in this from the part of the foundation's director. That is the problem. Because if she would be generous and would share the archive, so, you know, what I'm asking is that you're not challenging the relationships and the capitalistic structure, you're just challenging that she's not nice. Or I would say, as long as we all behave as we are supposed to behave in this world of symbolic capital, and we pretend that we are not egoistic, then it's okay.
Firstly, I'm not interested in morals. Morals are specific to religion and culture, and morality is highly subjective. As I brought up, I think that there's ethical questions, that you have the law and the way the law is enforced or not enforced, and then a whole series of ethical questions that get raised around that. I think that generosity is probably defined moralistically, and I think you could argue both sides of that. Federica is very generous with her time in that she has focused for so long on Baragan, or she's generous that she invited me for a slice of cake. I'm generous in that I make conceptual artwork and offer it to a community or a public to come and see the work. The distributor of the film is generous because they don't make a lot of money off documentaries. So there's a whole series of generosities. And so I think we all can choose how we're generous or not generous, but I certainly don't think that any of these questions here rely on generosity. These are real legal questions and have an absolute effect on people's lives and the experience or non-experience or accessibility or non-accessibility of artwork and architecture. And I would argue that the question, the ethical questions around how we want to think about property and intellectual property rights are some of the biggest questions of our time right now, as we move into even deeper into neoliberalism, when everything is for sale and economic structures are like the ruling thinking of everything we do, that it's quite important to, like, I can't tell you how many people are like, well, what's the problem? They bought the archive. They own it. As if, okay, we're done here. There's no questions. Of course, there's room for questions. And artwork has in my opinion, artwork has a responsibility to raise difficult questions. And it has to be robust enough to withstand those questions and generate them. So I think it's just a lot bigger than a question of like everyone play nice or not nice.
Hi, Jill. Hi, Regine. Thank you for your incredible discussion. I have 3 questions prepared from our online audience. And the first question comes from Ostrovska, and they ask, how does one move from such a project? Does one?
That's a good question. So I remember when I had a baby, my doctor said to me that 9 months up, 9 months down, it takes 9 months for your body to adjust to holding the baby, and then 9 months to adjust to not. And I think that these kind of extremely immersive projects where I'm flying to Mexico all the time to meet with the family, and I collaborated with many members of the art and architecture community in Mexico, and meeting with lawyers, and also trying to get as deeply immersed as I could in Baragan's work and his way of making it, that like I created a formal vocabulary over that period of time that permeates all of the works, and felt a kind of, I can't even think of the right word, but a kind of like intimacy with Baragan, or obviously my experience of Baragan, not with him, but my experience of him and his work. And it is really challenging to recover from that. Also, the making of a feature film is like nothing I ever experienced. Like, you live and breathe it for almost a year. So it did take a while, and I made a bunch of pieces along the way. I would say one of the most helpful works that I did, and actually still working on, is the 𝗃𝗏 Museum invited me to do an artist on artist talk. And it's when a contemporary artist picks an artist from their, that they've collected. And I picked Chantal Akerman. And it was a much quieter piece, and I immersed myself in her work and simultaneously was watching my son very carefully and writing about him while thinking about her work. And it was a way to kind of slowly, I mean, I'll always be immersed in the Baragan work. It's such a part of me, but it enabled me to see through my eyes in my personal life becoming my work, and also through another artist's work. And I would say there was something about that. But since then, I've made a bunch of works. But yes, it takes, you live with the ghost of it, and it permeates. So it's a great question, but I just try to take as much of that intimacy into the next, leaping into the next bodies of work, and also bringing, continuing that with work I've made.
The user by the name of Adnan asked the second question, or rather questions, and they say, might it be that they, 𝗃𝗏, and I say they because both of them were meeting you in the 𝗃𝗏 Cafe, might have already taken so much from the archive for their 𝗃𝗏 design concepts that there's not much left to share? Does artistic research not also count as scholarly research? And have you considered using the Swiss constitutional right, freedom of art, to defend against lawsuits coming from 𝗃𝗏?
Well, that's a lot of different questions. I just don't ever see Baragan's work as being exhausted, period. I mean, it's great work, and the whole general, or one underlining question of all of that is that, like, a work's relevancy, that, you know, my experience of Baragan's work today is really different than someone else's experience of Baragan's work when it was first made. It's always changing. So, and I think all of the work he made and all of the documentation of it, I just cannot fathom that it wouldn't always be generative, as long as people could access it. So, and the 𝗃𝗏 people have a great sense of design and design history. And so I don't want to speak for anyone, but I doubt that they would think that either. I'm trying to remember the other questions. Artistic research, scholarly research. As I say in the film, towards the end, that they're all extremely valuable. Scholarly research, and scholarly research isn't one thing. There's like many different approaches and angles. I think someone before mentioned Baragan didn't like women. Baragan loved women, from what I saw. That whether what his sexual orientation is a different thing, but there's many different ways to take pleasure from human beings, you know, as you see the beautiful women in the film were all part of his personal archive. So I think that Federica's work and other scholars' work is extremely invaluable. We need it. We also need an artistic point of view. We also probably need a million other point of views. That's what artwork is asking for. And all I'm arguing for is that there's a way to allow that legally, through access, through how documents are made accessible.
Now for our third and last question, the user by the name HHX asks, Baragan's residences were often within gated communities, the fountains protected by private courtyards, and he was often described as undemocratic. New Yorker writes of an anecdote when someone accused him of only designing houses for rich people, and he allegedly answered, and horses. Did you often think about what Baragan himself would have thought, or whose maybe side would he pick regarding your attempts to democratize access to art?
So this is also interesting, being an artist, right? Is like what it means to put art. There's one thing when you're making something in the studio, and there's another thing once you make the decision to put work out in the world, and you can't control it. Once it's out in the world, you can't control it, and that is scary, right? You do the best, at least I can say I do the best I can, making the work as beautiful as I can, and that means the question being beautiful and clear, and the work, you know, to the highest standards that I can make it. And then you put it out in the world, and there's a reaction. And then maybe in 20 years, there's another reaction. I mean, you see people's works all the time now as we become more aware of who's represented, who's not represented, people's ideas around a work change, you know, as culture changes. And that's just like what it is to make something and put it out in the world. And so, yes, Baragan was absolutely part of an elite group in Mexico and made decisions based on that. And that's a really interesting thing to think about that affects readings of his work. He also, I've heard that he did love women, but the second they started aging or had a wrinkle in their clothing, this was a close friend said this on live radio in Mexico, that he was no longer interested in them anymore. So, you know, how do I feel about that as a woman? You know, these are all questions. And then there's the work, you know, that he did put out there, that exists in the world that I'm reacting to. So you have these complicated layers, and I don't think I have an answer for that, but I do think that, you know, he was this amazing architect and artist, and put his work out into the world and affected lots of people. And the questions are around that work, and how do we or do we not engage it, and how is the law around that work. And in general, this isn't specific to just Baragan. I think it's really important that you could, I mean, even in the debate I had in Mexico, people were like, well, what about Gabriel Marquez, what about, you know, and all these people. And it's like, yes, what about them? What about that work? And how do we want to go forward with accessibility around work and ownership and property questions? And I'm just trying to make work that those questions are really continually debated, and hopefully the work continues to be seen or seen more.
Thank you a lot for these answers. I think this is it regarding the questions from the public. So thank you again, and I give the mic back to you.
Thank you, Neja. I think it's been a great way to end the stream. So I'm going to say a big thank you to Gilles, of course. Thank you to everyone who contributed with their questions through the chat. Thank you to the guests in Ljubljana. Thank you to Alenka, Maja, Matevž, and of course, big thank you to you, Marcela, Janez, everybody in Aksioma for this opportunity to know more about Gilles' works and ID, and also this opportunity to participate in a debate around artists' legacies and privatized power. So that's it for me, and I'm going to give the microphone back to Janez.
Thanks, Gilles, Regine. It was really a pleasure to host you in our virtual space and to listen to your discussion. I would like to thank also all of you who attended the event remotely and participated with your question via the web chat. And of course, a special thanks goes to our guest who joined us here physically at Kino-Šiška today. I would like to take the chance to remind you once again that the proposal is available in Slovenia until January 15 as video on demand. If you want to watch it, you can find all the information in the link here below. If you are interested in other streaming events or other artist talk we have produced, I suggest you to have a look at our YouTube and Vimeo channels. Instead, if you want to stay informed about our programs, events, exhibitions, publications, etc., follow us on social networks. I guess that's all for today. Thanks again, Gilles, Regine. Greetings from Ljubljana to both of you. Na svidenje. Thank you.